How's it going, friends, and welcome to the channel. So in this video we're going to be looking at a little diorama. I got some really cheap good old 00 gauge coaches off eBay. Not in the best condition, but that's fine because I don't want them to be, because they're not going to end up in a nice state by the end of it. So I've decided to make this into one video. I was going to split it into two, with just one of the coaches and then one of the base, but for an extra 10 minutes on a video than what I normally do, I might as well. And if I'm being completely honest, I'm not sure how well this video is going to go anyway, because it is a little bit off from what I usually do, and those videos in the past haven't done very well. But maybe you guys will enjoy this. I do hope you do enjoy it. So if you stick around till the end, and you will see the finished model. So what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be making two coaches into three, some graffiti, and a shed load of weathering. So grab yourself a brew and a bicky, and we'll jump straight into it. So we have our coaches. Of course, these are a 00 gauge coaches. Got these off eBay nice and cheap, because I didn't want to spend a lot of money on these because they're not going to look good by the end of it. And also what I have in planned for one of these coaches, it's not going to go well for it, so it wasn't worth spending the money. What I did find weird opening was that creepy figure in the window. It's just weird. The first time I actually opened this, that was the first thing that come out, and I just didn't know what to do. I nearly chucked it across the room. It's just creepy. So yeah, these coaches aren't in the best condition, but it doesn't really matter, because like we says, we're going to make these coaches look dog rough. So there was a little bit of repairing that I needed to do. So I dismantled the coaches, which is not a lot to dismantle. It's just popping the roof off, taking the plastic, which is for the glass, which I'll be replacing later on, and then all I did was give everything a nice clean up. So before I go any further with these, I want to make sure they're going to fit on the diorama the way I want them to. Now, for the base of this diorama, I'm using an old drawer front. It just saved me a bit of money, basically, but I've got to try and fill that slot in there. The hole in the middle is not much of an issue. Now, I could just go with this two coaches side by side, but it's a little bit boring, really. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut quarter off the one and have that sit behind the full coach, and then have the rest on the other side, or what's left of it, in front of the two. So like I says, I want to get a rough idea of how these are going to fit onto the base, and then put my cut in. So once I've roughly figured out where I want it to go, I've just roughly measured it out, lined it out with the pencil and the ruler. I didn't want to, I tried to make it kind of look a little bit more interesting, rather than having it cut off in a very in the flat part, or where there isn't a window, which this does make things a little bit awkward for me a bit later on. But yeah, we've got to try and make it look a bit interesting. So next I get my trusted JLC saw out. These are cracking little tools. If you haven't got one already, they make some really nice fine cuts. Now for this it doesn't particularly actually matter. I could have just cropped out the good old junior hacksaw, but to be fair, that would have made a lot more of a mess than what this does. So after going all the way around the coach, we have our two coaches. Now, I didn't cut it, admittedly, very straight, but this is something I can sort out a little bit later on. But here you can sort of see kind of how this is going to look in the end. Now, I didn't do a very good job of filling in the gaps that clip the roof on. So what I did was I put some paint around the door frame and then cut it out onto some styrene card, and with a little bit of fuse wire made a nice little handle, and quite easily popped them in. Didn't really need to glue them in because I actually made a relatively decent fit, but yeah, that looks way better. So next was to fill this gap in the roofing. So I used some green stuff. It's nice two-part epoxy. Just twist the two pieces together to make it green, because of course it's green stuff. And then all I needed to do then was to fill the gap. Now, it did take me a while to get this looking relatively decent. Sculpting is not one of my strong suits. So for most of this I used the back of a paint stirrer, as it was nice and flat, and yeah, got a relatively nice flat surface on there, and I think I blended it quite well. I don't think you'd particularly notice it unless you looked really closely at it. So I've ended up doing a bit more work for myself here than I actually intended to. I've ended up repainting it. Yeah, it looked a little bit ropier than I initially thought, so I went over it. For some reason, I think it might have been because I went too heavy with the primer. There was a few cracks come in there, but to be honest, actually, for this project, it's actually going to work out quite well, giving that a bit more of a distressed look. So just to make things easier for me, I just went with the same colours. So I used buff, if I remember rightly, for the cream banding, and then a relatively dark red for the rest of the bodywork. So of course, obviously that means taping this off, which took a while to get a little bit straight, but we'll get there in the end. But yeah, just make sure you get all your your edges of tape down quite well. There's quite a lot of moulded detailing, so it was quite difficult to get some of the masking tape to conform around those shapes. There is a black band that needs to go between the red part and the section where the windows are, so I'll mask that all off there as well and paint that black. So I'm replacing the windows as well with this clear bit of acetate. Also with this will give us, and doing it this way, will make sure that they're fitted right up against the window frames, where the original one didn't. And also because there's no interior in this model, which I actually thought that one of them actually had, I decided to use some matte varnish to frost the windows. Now I'm using this glowing glaze. I use it quite regularly for putting my canopies on. It's really good stuff. It dries really clear, which is good, so if you do go over a little bit, it's not a problem. Unfortunately, because I forgot, should have really removed a couple of the pins that you can see in the bottom of the coach there to hold the original plastic in for the glass. So when I eventually put the windows in, it went everywhere. So some of this obviously got onto the matte varnish and took it away. It's not really much of an issue because I can go back and sort this out later. The matte varnish I've used for this is MIG's Ultra Matte, and it is really good ultra matte varnish, but get a little bit of water on it and it's gone. So, and with this glue, it did take it away. But it's not a problem, because at the end of the build we're gonna have to put matte varnish on it anyway, so it's not really much of an issue. Now for the other two coat sections, I've had to kind of build them all together, because I've had to put a piece of plasticard at the ends, and it was a lot easier to do the roof section with this part. So I've painted it in a relatively light grey, and then gave it a few coats of hairspray, because I'm going to do the classic hairspray technique, and I'm actually using hairspray this time because I've got quite a large can of the stuff, so that's why you can see that nice glossy surface there. And I'm putting pretty much the same dark grey colour. I'm just added a little bit more black to it, just to darken it off a little bit. So for those of you who don't know how this chipping technique works, just put some water over a top coat, and with either a pin or a needle, or even a classic cocktail stick or a stiff brush, you know, because the water has activated it all. We go over with any of these tools and start removing away some of the paint, which give us this nice worn peeled look. So now I'm going to add some grimy, dirty streaks coming from these roof vents, again to give it this sort of age look, that they've been there for quite a considerable amount of time. Now, because I'm also going to be adding sort of a moss effect to the top of the coaches and down some of the sides, I'm using AK's dark green. This is mainly a wash for you know, olive drab vehicles mainly, but in the case this actually looks and works quite well. And also because I've made these streaks a little bit too fat, with a damp brush with some white spirits on, and preferably a relatively flat brush, we can push all of that enamel paint into the centre and create a thinner line. Also, if you want to remove it, this is what you want to be using. So for the moss, I'm using the sponge technique for this one. So we've got a bit of sponge, dipped it in some relatively bright green paint, and what we need to do now is actually get rid of most of the paint that's on the sponge. So all we've got is a bit of a faint amount of paint coming off. Now I didn't actually get as much paint off as I intended to, but I did want quite a lot on these roofs, so in a fashion it didn't really matter, but it's best to sort of work with a little bit on there. It's easier to add than it is to remove. So yeah, so make sure you've got just, you know, a little bit of that paint coming off, because if you're not happy with that small amount, you can add it on. It's a lot more difficult to try and take it away. So I'm no real good freehand artist in the slightest, so as you can see I have done a few very bad graffiti on there. I bought these decals. They're not very good. Well, they're okay, but they're probably better if you're putting on to more of a flatter surface. Now these are specifically double O gauge decals, so that's 1/72, but to try and get them to conform to some of the lines on the coach, took quite a bit of persuading, particularly when we get to the windows. I have got some longer decals in there, like this one. This one wasn't too bad, but there was some that were a bit taller, which I decided not to use because I just couldn't get them to fit round the window, and I had to cut them into place, and it just didn't look very good. So I went to the ones that just sat underneath the window or smaller. So after putting all the decals on, I went over with some Florey's wash. I used the dark grime for this. Once it had dried, I took off most of it and leaving it into those recesses, and then I went in with some rust chipping. These I got all from AK's rust paint set range, so you've got pretty much everything you really need for rusting. But I needed a little bit of light rust because being on quite a small scale, I wasn't going to go through all the sort of variational tones. So I started with a relatively dark brown or an old rust within sort of the areas that I got chipped, and those bits that are cracked earlier in the base coating, I put them into there, and then used between sort of a light rust and a slightly fresher rust to give the impression that, you know, with the rain, you know, obviously rust will run when it's sort of like a fresh rust. Then after that I come back in with the dark grime, again doing exactly the same as we did on the roof. Now on the side of this one I actually used a dry brush to try and feather these down a little bit. In some cases they're okay. In cases like this, it was a little bit more than what I wanted. So coming in again with a damp brush with some white spirits on, I can clean that all up and, you know, thin those streaks back down, make them look a bit fainter, and just feather them out a little bit better. So now it's time to look at the lower half of the coach, and I decided to make it look a bit sort of dirty and grimy by using some pigments. So what I did was, as a binder or a fixer, a pigment fixer, I've used some white spirits and working in small sections, putting the white spirit on, and then using some dark earth and some soot pigment, pretty much dry on the brush, but once it hits that white spirit, obviously it starts to thicken and bind, and with it thickening as well, that also created a nice dirt, grime, old looking effect. Now I do apologise, I realise I've jumped ahead a little bit. I haven't really shown you how we did the base. Basically used a bit of modelling foam for that sort of raised bit at the back, and then covered it all with some plaster. Now for the, I'm going to call them rail ties, and that's the American term for it, and I've completely forgot what we call them. It's just gone out of my head. So I've painted them in a sort of relatively dark brown, because the sleepers, because that's what we call them, are kind of like coated in this sort of like bitumen sort of paint to sort of make them last a number of years. So I've just used some really dark brown there to sort of try and emulate those sleepers. Then after that I lightly dry brushed over the top of the sleepers with a medium grey from AK's wood weathering range, just to give you that sort of old aged sort of bleached looking effect. The rails I painted starting with a medium red rust, and then worked my way up to slightly which is actually called light rust, again to give you those idea that those tracks have been there for a number of of years. Now normally I would clean up the rail heads, but because they've been sat there not been used for a number of years, there was really no point in doing that whatsoever. Now for that embankment, I tried to make it look like sandstone. Didn't really turn out very well, so I went over with sort of like a bit of a grey wash over the top. And for all the areas, most of the areas around it, I went over with Tamiya's flat earth, because around this sort of area here I'm going to have some vegetation. Before we go into putting the vegetation down, I'm going to put the ballast down. I pretty much gave the base a coating with some relatively watered down PVA. I think it was nearly 50-50. So just slather that all on and then put our ballast down. Now the only thing I had in stock for ballast was this medium cinder ballast from Woodland Scenics. Later on I will give this a bit of a dry brushing with sort of like a very light grey colour. As you can see, just cover out, you know, wherever we've put our glue down, and then just to make sure it all definitely sticks to itself and the base, I'll water the PVA down a lot more so it will sink in all the way through. Of course it does make a considerable amount of mess, but it will make sure all that ballast will stick down. Now for the vegetation, I'm using again Woodland Scenics, and I'm using a coarse turf for this. I used a light green and I think it was a medium olive, just to give you sort of slight variations, sort of like new growth, but just a bit of variation in there, just so it's not all the same colour. And again, because I'd already put some PVA glue down beforehand just to help it stick, but I went over it again with some very liquidized PVA glue again to help this all stick together. Also, what helps to get this all to set is some isopropanol, which is basically rubbing alcohol, and that will take out some of the surface tension in the PVA and water. I also added some flowers to try and make it look a little bit pretty, which was basically some crayons that I'd shaved down. Now I'm using some tufts of grass, for obviously tufts of grass. These have got quite a good sticky base to them, as you'll see in a second. They stick well to the tweezers, but just to make sure that they do stay down permanently, I did put a little bit of PVA glue down underneath. They're also quite good if you cut them up a little bit into sort of thin strips and small little sections to fit in to smaller areas. So my last little detail to put in is some resin printed bunny rabbits. Nice and small, and they pretty much disappear into the landscape when they're put in. But before we do that, it's back to me. So there we go, my friends, it's nearly time to show you the complete and finished model. But before that, I'd just like to thank you guys ever so much for watching. I do hope you have enjoyed the video. If you're new around here and you have enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. If you guys would also like to help support me and the videos, there are links in the description for you to do that. Everything that you guys donate goes straight back into the channel and the work that I do. And for those that you have donated, I thoroughly appreciate it ever so much, and yeah, it's great. Thank you guys so much. So that's it from me. Again, I hope you guys have enjoyed the video, and here's the finished model.